I once worked with a man successful by every measure society offers, who came to me because he could no longer sleep. He had a good marriage, children, a respected position, financial security, yet every night, as he lay in bed, a small, nameless anxiety would rise in his chest. He couldn't explain it. There was no crisis, no obvious problem, just this quiet, persistent feeling that something was off. But you see, I told him something he didn't expect. This feeling isn't your enemy. It's your psyche trying to save your life. That small discomfort wasn't a symptom to eliminate. It was a messenger he'd been ignoring for years. And learning to listen to it changed everything. Today, I want to teach you what I taught him. How to hear the whispers before they become screams. Before we continue, I must ask something of you. If these ideas genuinely resonate with you, if you find value in this exploration of the psyche, consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a comment below sharing what city and time you are watching from. I'm genuinely curious where in the world these ideas are finding their audience. Psychology, true psychology, is not mere theory. It lives in the real experiences of real people, in every corner of the world. So please, share where you are. Now, let us proceed. In the next 50 minutes, I'm going to teach you something most people never learn. How to read the language of your own unconscious before it has to speak in symptoms. You will learn to recognize the subtle signals your psyche sends when something in your life has become misaligned with your true nature. You will understand why ignoring small feelings creates large crises, and why honoring them creates transformation. You know something isn't quite right in your life, but you can't name it. There's no dramatic crisis to point to, no obvious problem to solve. Just this persistent, quiet discomfort, a vague sense that you're living slightly to the left of where you're meant to be. You feel it in the mornings, in moments of quiet, in the space between tasks. You've tried to analyze it away, to logic it into submission, but it remains. And so you begin to doubt yourself. Maybe I'm just ungrateful. Maybe this is just how life feels. Maybe everyone feels this way and I simply need to accept it. But that doubt, that dismissal, it makes the feeling worse, doesn't it? The unconscious is not silent. It is constantly communicating with you through what I call the feeling function, through emotions, intuitions, bodily sensations, dreams, and those small, persistent discomforts you keep trying to ignore. These are not weaknesses. They are the psyche's navigation system, trying to guide you toward individuation, toward becoming who you actually are, rather than who you've been conditioned to be. But modern life has taught you to override this system, to prioritize external demands over internal truth. And this is why so many people reach midlife, only to discover they've been living someone else's idea of a good life. I'm not going to give you positive thinking or surface optimism. I'm going to teach you to do something far more difficult and far more valuable. To listen. To develop what I call a relationship with your unconscious, to treat these quiet feelings not as problems to fix, but as messages to decode. Most approaches to psychology try to eliminate discomfort. I'm teaching you to learn from it, because your discomfort knows something your conscious mind has refused to see. I've spent my entire life studying the human psyche, not from a distance, but intimately, through thousands of hours sitting with people's actual suffering, their actual transformation. I've seen what happens when people ignore the quiet feelings. They become neurotic, depressed, physically ill, or they simply wake up one day in a life that feels utterly foreign to them. And I've seen what happens when they finally learn to listen. They come alive. They find meaning. They become themselves. This isn't theory. This is what actually happens. Right now, You treat that quiet feeling like an inconvenience, something to dismiss or medicate or explain away. By the end of this conversation, you'll understand it as a gift, as your psyche's way of protecting you from wasting your one precious life on a path that isn't yours. You'll learn to distinguish between neurotic anxiety, which comes from avoiding your true path, and authentic discomfort, which comes from walking it. You'll discover that the feeling you've been afraid of is actually the doorway to the life you've been longing for. Let me tell you more about the man who couldn't sleep. His name was Heinrich, and he was an architect, 43 years old. He had designed buildings across Europe, structures of beauty and precision that would stand for generations. On paper, his life was exactly what he'd worked toward. He'd married the woman his family approved of. A kind woman from a good family. They had 3 children who were healthy and well-behaved. His practice was thriving. He had respect, income, stability. Everything was in order, and yet, he couldn't sleep. It started small, as these things always do. He would lie in bed and feel a slight tightness in his chest, a vague restlessness. At first, he attributed it to work stress, a difficult client, a challenging project deadline. He thought, if he just worked harder, solved the problem, the feeling would go away. But it didn't. If anything, it grew. He tried everything he could think of. He went to doctors, who found nothing wrong with him. His heart was strong, his blood work perfect. They suggested perhaps he needed a vacation, some rest. So he took his family to the mountains for 2 weeks. Beautiful scenery, fresh air, peaceful walks, and still, every night, there it was, that small, nameless anxiety rising in his chest the moment he lay down to sleep. He began to dread bedtime. The feeling started appearing at other times too, in the middle of meetings, during Sunday dinners with his family, while he was drafting plans at his desk. It had no clear trigger, no logical explanation. And this disturbed him deeply because Heinrich was a rational man. He lived by precision, by logic, by clear cause and effect. But this feeling followed no rules he understood. That's when he came to me. He sat in my office, impeccably dressed, posture perfect, and he said something I've heard countless times in my work. "Dr. Jung, I don't understand what's wrong with me. I have everything I should want. I should be happy. But I'm not. There's this feeling, and I need you to help me make it stop." I looked at him for a long moment. And then I said, "What if the feeling isn't the problem? What if the feeling is trying to tell you something you need to hear?" He looked at me as though I'd spoken a foreign language. "But there's nothing wrong," he insisted. "My life is good. The feeling doesn't make sense. The unconscious," I told him, "doesn't speak in the language of logic. It speaks in the language of symbol, of sensation, of feeling. And when you ignore its voice, it speaks louder. Tell me, Heinrich, what does this feeling feel like? If it could speak, what would it say?" He struggled with this. He was not a man accustomed to listening to feelings. But slowly, haltingly, he began to describe it. "It felt," he said, "like homesickness, like longing, like some essential part of him was locked away in a room he'd forgotten how to open. We worked together for many months, and gradually, through dreams, through careful attention to what made the feeling stronger and what made it softer, a truth began to emerge. Heinrich had wanted to be an artist. As a young man, he had painted wild, passionate, expressive work. But his father had been clear. Art was not a respectable profession. Architecture was practical, stable, honorable. So Heinrich had, buried his artistic nature beneath layers of responsibility and rational achievement. He had built a good life. Yes, but it wasn't his life. It was the life he thought he should live. The quiet feeling in his chest was his unlived life, knocking. It was the artist in him, the creative spirit, the part of his soul that needed expression and beauty and freedom, and it refused to stay silent any longer. It was trying to save him from wasting his one precious existence living someone else's story. When he finally understood this, when he finally listened, everything changed. He didn't abandon his family or his practice, but he began to paint again. Early mornings before work, late evenings after dinner. He rearranged his life to make space for what his soul actually needed. And you know what happened? He started sleeping again. The anxiety lifted. He became more alive, more present, more himself than he had been in 20 years. But his story revealed something about the nature of these feelings that took even me years to fully understand. These small, quiet discomforts are not random. They are not chemical imbalances or character flaws or signs of weakness. They are the psyche's early warning system. They are how the self, that deeper, truer center of your being, communicates that you have drifted off course. And if you learn to listen to them while they're still small, while they're still gentle whispers, you can make the corrections you need before the psyche has to create a crisis to get your attention. Let me share another story with you. I worked with a woman named Elizabeth who kept having the same dream. In the dream, she was walking through a garden that had once been beautiful, but was now completely overgrown and neglected. Weeds everywhere, dead plants, broken trellises, and in the dream, she felt overwhelming sadness, as though something precious had been abandoned and forgotten. She mentioned this dream to me almost casually at first. Just a recurring dream, she said, probably meaningless. But I've learned that when the unconscious repeats an image, it's trying to communicate something important. So I asked her to sit with the dream, to feel it, to let it speak to her without analyzing it away. Elizabeth was a school teacher, 48 years old, unmarried, living alone. She was devoted to her students, worked long hours, and was respected by everyone who knew her. But her own life, her personal life, had become small. She had no hobbies, no creative pursuits, no time for beauty or pleasure or joy. She lived entirely for duty, for service to others, for being useful and responsible. The garden in her dream was her own inner life, her creativity, her sensuality, her capacity for joy and beauty and play. These parts of her had been neglected for so long that they were dying, and her unconscious was showing her this truth in the only language it knows, symbol. At first, she dismissed the dream. She was too busy to think about such things. There were lessons to plan, papers to grade, students who needed her. But the dream persisted. And then, slowly, other symptoms began to appear. She developed chronic fatigue, headaches, a heaviness in her body that wouldn't lift. She went to doctors, who found nothing medically wrong, but her body knew what her mind refused to acknowledge. She was living a half-life, and the unlived part of her was making her sick. It was only when she finally took the dream seriously, when she began to tend her inner garden, taking up watercolor painting again, allowing herself walks in nature, permitting herself pleasure and beauty and time for her own soul, that her health returned. The moment she honored what the feeling had been trying to tell her, the symptoms vanished. These stories aren't coincidences. They reveal a pattern, a law of the psyche that operates in every human life. Whether we acknowledge it or not, the psyche will not allow itself to be ignored indefinitely. It will speak quietly first, through small feelings, vague discomforts, subtle unease. But if you dismiss these whispers, it will escalate. It will speak through dreams, through symptoms, through increasingly loud disturbances in your life. And if you still refuse to listen, it will create a crisis, a breakdown, an illness, a catastrophe that forces you to finally pay attention. I know this not just from my patients, but from my own life. There was a period in my early career when I was following a path that looked absolutely correct from the outside. I was working with Freud, learning psychoanalysis, building a reputation in the medical community. It was the sensible path. The path of professional success and acceptance. But there was a feeling I kept pushing down. A quiet sense that this wasn't fully my path, that there was something else I needed to explore, some deeper truth about the psyche that didn't fit within the boundaries of Freud's system. I ignored that feeling for a long time. I told myself I was being foolish, grandiose, arrogant to think I might see something the great Freud didn't see. But the feeling grew. My dreams became turbulent, disturbing, full of strange symbols and powerful emotions. I began to feel a kind of inner pressure, as though something in me was demanding to be born, but I kept refusing to let it emerge. Finally, I made the decision that changed my life. I broke with Freud. I followed the feeling, even though it meant professional isolation, ridicule from my colleagues, years of uncertainty and struggle. I descended into what I later called my confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense psychological upheaval, where I had to face everything I'd been avoiding, everything that didn't fit the rational, acceptable version of myself. It was the most difficult period of my life. But it was also when I discovered the ideas that became my life's work. The collective unconscious, the archetypes, the process of individuation. None of that would have emerged if I hadn't listened to the quiet feeling that told me I was living someone else's version of psychology instead of discovering my own. And this is what I learned from that experience. The little feeling that quietly wants change is not asking you to destroy your life. It's asking you to find your life, to live your life, to become who you actually are instead of who you think you should be. And the cost of ignoring it is far greater than the cost of listening to it. Now that you understand what these feelings look like in real lives, we must ask the deeper question. What are they? Where do they come from? And why do they have such power over us? Let me speak to you about what I call the feeling function. In my understanding of the psyche, there are 4 fundamental ways human beings orient themselves to reality: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuiting. Most people are familiar with thinking, the rational, logical, analytical function. This is what our culture values most. We are taught to think our way through problems, to analyze, to use reason. But feeling is an entirely different kind of intelligence. It's not emotionalism, though many people confuse the two. Feeling is a way of evaluating, of knowing what matters, of determining value and meaning. When you think about something, you ask, is this logical? Is this true? Is this consistent? But when you feel about something, you ask, is this meaningful? Is this valuable? Does this matter to me? Does this align with who I am? Feeling is how you know that a technically correct decision might still be wrong for you. It's how you know that something can be perfectly logical and still feel deeply false. The feeling function evaluates reality according to a different standard than thinking does, not the standard of logic, but the standard of meaning, of soul, of what your deepest self actually needs and values. Modern culture has systematically devalued this function. We're taught that feelings are subjective, unreliable, something to overcome or control with reason. We're taught to trust data over intuition, logic over emotional truth, external success over inner alignment. And this has created an epidemic of people living rational, successful, completely empty lives. They've achieved everything thinking told them to achieve. But they feel dead inside, because they never asked whether those achievements actually mattered to their feeling nature, to their soul. The quiet feelings you've been ignoring are your feeling function trying to speak. They're your psyche's way of telling you that something in your life, a relationship, a career, a way of being, doesn't align with your actual values, your actual nature, your actual soul. And no amount of rational justification can silence that voice, because it speaks from a deeper place than reason can reach. This brings us to another crucial understanding. The unconscious speaks in its own language. It doesn't send you a memo that says, "You're on the wrong path. Please course correct." It speaks in symbols, in sensations, in dreams, in those small, persistent feelings that don't make logical sense, but carry profound emotional truth. The unconscious is like a wise but nonverbal part of yourself. It sees the whole picture of your life, not just what you're conscious of, but all the parts you've repressed, denied, forgotten, or never acknowledged. It sees where you're betraying yourself. It sees what you're afraid to see. And it tries to communicate this to you in the only ways it can. Through feeling, through symbol, through the body, through dreams. And here's the crucial part. It always starts gently. That's what most people don't understand. The unconscious doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to guide you, to help you, to bring you into wholeness and truth. So it begins with whispers, a small discomfort, a vague unease, a quiet sense that something's off. These are gentle invitations to pay attention, to look more closely, to ask what might need to change. But if you ignore the whispers, the unconscious has no choice but to speak louder. The small feeling becomes a persistent anxiety. The vague discomfort becomes a physical symptom. The quiet dream becomes a nightmare. The gentle unease becomes depression or illness, or a life crisis that forces you to finally stop and listen. I've seen this pattern hundreds of times. Someone comes to me in the midst of a breakdown, their marriage has fallen apart, or they've developed a mysterious illness, or they've lost all sense of meaning and purpose. And when we trace it back, we always find the same thing. There were warning signs. Small feelings they dismissed. Quiet truths they ignored. The psyche tried to speak gently for years, sometimes decades. But they were too busy, too rational, too committed to keeping everything together to listen. And so the unconscious finally had to shout. This is why learning to listen to small feelings is so crucial. Not because the feelings themselves are the point, but because they're the earliest, gentlest form of communication from the deeper self that's trying to guide you toward the life you're actually meant to live. Now, let's go deeper. These little feelings that want change, they're not random disturbances. They're directly connected to what I call the process of individuation. This is perhaps the most important concept I can share with you. So please listen carefully. Individuation is the process of becoming who you actually are, not who your parents wanted you to be, not who society expects you to be, not the persona you've constructed to fit in and succeed, but your true self. It's the journey from living according to collective values and external expectations to living according to your own inner law, your own deepest nature. Every human being has within them what I call the self, with a capital S. This is not the ego, not the conscious personality you think of as me. The self is the deeper organizing center of the psyche, the totality of who you are, including all the parts you're not yet conscious of. And the self has its own intelligence, its own purpose, its own direction for your life. The problem is that from the moment you're born, you begin learning to be acceptable, to fit in, to survive in your family and culture. You develop what I call a persona, a social mask, an adapted self that knows how to function in the world. This isn't bad. It's necessary. You need a persona to navigate social reality. But the danger comes when you mistake the persona for the self. When you believe the mask is who you actually are, you become the good son, the successful professional, the responsible parent, the helpful friend. You build a life that looks right, that earns approval and respect. But somewhere deep inside, there's a quiet voice saying, "This isn't me. This isn't the whole truth of who I am." That voice is the self, calling you toward individuation, toward becoming the unique individual you were meant to be, rather than a copy of collective expectations. And this is where the little feeling comes in. That quiet discomfort you can't explain, that vague sense that something's missing. It's often the self trying to get your attention. It's your deeper nature rebelling against a life that's too small, too false, too adapted to what others need from you, rather than what you actually are. The self will not tolerate being ignored indefinitely. As you move through life, especially as you approach midlife, the pressure to individuate intensifies. What worked when you were 20 living according to external scripts, performing the roles you thought you should perform stops working. The psyche demands more. It demands truth. It demands that you finally become yourself. And if you refuse, if you keep clinging to the persona, to the safe and acceptable life, the psyche will create whatever crisis is necessary to break you open. This is what I call the midlife crisis. Though it can happen at any age, it's when the unlived life can no longer be contained. When the parts of yourself you've repressed rise up and demand recognition. The little feeling that quietly wants change is the self's first, kindest invitation to this process. It's saying, "There's more to you than this. There's a life you haven't lived, a truth you haven't spoken, a way of being you haven't allowed yourself, and I need you to pay attention before I have to force your attention." Now, I need to make an important distinction, because not all discomfort is equal, and many people confuse two very different kinds of anxiety. There's neurotic anxiety, and there's authentic discomfort. Understanding the difference between these two is essential. Neurotic anxiety is what you feel when you're avoiding your true path. It's the anxiety that comes from living inauthentically, from betraying your own nature, from ignoring the call of the self. This is the anxiety Heinrich felt lying in bed at night, that nameless dread that had no external cause. It wasn't caused by his life circumstances. It was caused by the gap between the life he was living and the life his soul needed to live. Neurotic anxiety is circular and paralyzing. It doesn't point you anywhere. It just makes you feel trapped, restless, wrong. And no amount of external change helps, because the problem isn't external. The problem is that you're abandoning yourself, and the psyche is protesting. But authentic discomfort is completely different. This is the discomfort you feel when you are walking your true path, when you're honoring the self's call, even though it's difficult, or scary, or socially awkward. This is the discomfort Heinrich felt when he first started painting again, the vulnerability of doing something that mattered deeply to him. The fear of being seen in his authentic creative expression. The uncertainty of stepping off the conventional path. Authentic discomfort is directional. It points you somewhere. It says, "This is hard, but it's right. This scares you, but it's true. This doesn't fit the plan, but it's necessary." And when you move through authentic discomfort, you feel more alive. Not less. You feel scared but real, anxious but aligned. Here's the paradox that most people never understand. Avoiding authentic discomfort creates neurotic anxiety. When you refuse to face the right kind of discomfort, the discomfort of growth, of truth, of becoming yourself, you create the wrong kind of anxiety, the kind that just eats away at you without leading anywhere. The little feeling is often inviting you into authentic discomfort. It's saying, there's something here you need to face. Something you need to change. And yes, it will be uncomfortable, but it's the right kind of uncomfortable. It's the discomfort of growing into who you actually are, rather than shrinking into who you think you should be. Learning to distinguish between these two kinds of discomfort is transformational, because once you see the difference, you stop trying to eliminate all discomfort and start asking, what is this feeling asking me to face? What truth is trying to emerge? Now I must speak to you about what happens when you ignore these quiet feelings, because this is where the shadow enters. The shadow, in my understanding, is all the parts of yourself you've rejected, denied, or refused to acknowledge. It's everything that doesn't fit your conscious image of who you are. When you ignore a feeling, when you dismiss a truth, when you refuse to acknowledge a longing or a need or a part of yourself that doesn't fit your persona, where does it go? It doesn't disappear. It goes into the shadow. It goes into the unconscious, where it accumulates like water behind a dam. Heinrich's artistic nature went into his shadow. For 20 years, he denied that part of himself, pretended it didn't exist, built a life that had no room for it. But it didn't cease to exist. It lived in his unconscious, growing stronger, more desperate, until it manifested as the anxiety that wouldn't let him sleep. Elizabeth's capacity for joy, for beauty, for personal pleasure, all of this went into her shadow while she lived entirely for duty and service, and it manifested as physical exhaustion, as the dream of the dying garden, as her body literally becoming too tired to continue living a life that denied half of who she was. This is what happens when you ignore the little feeling. The unlived life accumulates in the shadow, and the shadow has power. It affects your mood, your energy, your health, your dreams, your relationships. It creates symptoms because symptoms are the psyche's final language when all other forms of communication have been ignored. Depression, very often, is frozen energy, the energy of the unlived life that can't move, can't express, can't become what it needs to become. It's the self, paralyzed by your refusal to listen to it. Anxiety, often, is unexpressed truth. It's what you know but won't admit, what you feel but won't honor, what you need but won't ask for. The truth tries to emerge, but you push it down, and the energy of that repression becomes anxiety. And physical illness so often. This is the psyche's last resort. When emotional symptoms don't get your attention, when dreams don't wake you up, when feelings don't move you, the body speaks. The body becomes the messenger of the unlived life. I'm not saying all illness is psychological, but I am saying that the psyche and soma are not separate. They're one system, and when the psyche is in distress, the body will eventually express that distress if you don't listen to the earlier, gentler warnings. This is why honoring the little feeling is so important. It's the earliest point of intervention. It's when you can still make gentle adjustments instead of waiting for a crisis. When you listen to the whispers, you prevent the screams. But listening alone is not enough. This brings me to one of the most important ideas I've developed: the transcendent function. The transcendent function is the psyche's capacity to hold opposites in tension until a third thing emerges, something new that transcends and includes both poles. You see, the problem most people face is that they think they have to choose between consciousness and unconscious, between reason and feeling, between the life they've built and the life they long for. They think it's either or. Either I honor this feeling or I honor my responsibilities. Either I'm rational or I'm emotional. Either I keep the persona or I destroy everything. But this is a false dichotomy. The transcendent function shows us another way. When you can hold the tension between opposites, between who you've been and who you're becoming, between external duty and inner truth, between thinking and feeling without collapsing into one side or the other, something remarkable happens. A third possibility emerges that you couldn't have imagined from either pole alone. Heinrich didn't have to choose between being a responsible architect and being an artist. He found a way to integrate both. Elizabeth didn't have to choose between caring for her students and caring for herself. She found a way to honor both. I didn't have to choose between professional respectability and psychological truth. I found a path that ultimately honored both, though it took years of walking through uncertainty to discover it. The little feeling is often one pole of an opposition. It's the voice of the unlived life, the repressed truth, the denied self, your conscious commitments, your responsibilities, your persona. That's the other pole. And the work of individuation is not to choose one and destroy the other. It's to hold both in consciousness, to feel the tension between them, to stay present to the conflict until the transcendent function can operate, until a new possibility emerges that honors the truth of both. This is difficult work. It requires what I call the symbolic attitude, the ability to see your life not just literally but symbolically, to understand that the conflicts you face are not just practical problems, but psychological and spiritual struggles that contain the potential for transformation. The little feeling isn't just telling you to quit your job or leave your marriage or abandon your life. It's inviting you into a process of transformation, where something old must be honored even as something new is born. It's asking you to become larger, more conscious, more whole, to find a way of living that includes more of who you actually are. This is the promise of listening to the quiet feeling. Not destruction, but integration. Not chaos, but transformation. Not the abandonment of your life, but the discovery of your actual life beneath the layers of should and must and have to. Understanding these principles intellectually is valuable, but it means nothing without practice. So now, we must turn to the question: how do you actually do this? How do you listen to what you've spent years ignoring? Let me give you some very simple, very practical ways to begin developing a relationship with your unconscious. To start hearing the quiet voice that's been trying to guide you. First, the morning check-in. This is perhaps the simplest and most powerful practice I can offer you. Before you begin your day, before you check messages, or make plans, or put on your persona, spend 5 minutes alone with yourself. Sit quietly. Place your hand on your heart or your belly and simply ask, what am I feeling right now? Don't analyze. Don't judge. Don't try to make sense of it or talk yourself out of it. Just notice. Just feel. You might feel nothing at first. Or you might feel anxiety, sadness, restlessness, longing, any number of things. Whatever arises, acknowledge it. Write it down in a journal. This is how you begin to develop a relationship with your inner life. Over time, patterns will emerge. You'll notice that certain feelings come up again and again. You'll see connections between your inner state and your outer circumstances. You'll begin to recognize the voice of the self beneath the noise of daily demands. This practice builds the muscle of inner listening. It teaches you that your feelings matter, that they contain intelligence, that they deserve your attention. Second, honor small truths. This is where you begin to act on what you're learning about yourself. When a quiet no arises in you to a request, to an expectation, to a way of being practice, respecting it, even in small ways. When a gentle yes appears a longing to try something, to say something, to change something, practice following it, even if it feels awkward or irrational. Start small. You don't have to revolutionize your life overnight. But if you feel a quiet impulse to take a different route home, take it. If you feel a small resistance to a social obligation that isn't essential, Honor it. If you feel a gentle pull toward painting or writing or walking in nature, give yourself permission. These small acts of integrity build trust with your unconscious. The psyche learns that you're listening, that honoring the inner voice is possible, that your feelings won't be dismissed. And as that trust builds, the communication becomes clearer, stronger, more reliable. You develop confidence in your own inner guidance. Third, work with your dreams. Your dreams are direct letters from the unconscious. They show you what your conscious mind refuses to see. They reveal the emotional truth beneath the rational surface. They warn you when you're off path. They guide you toward what you need. Keep a journal by your bed. The moment you wake, before you move or think or start your day, write down whatever fragments of dreams you remember. Don't worry if they don't make sense. Don't interpret too quickly. Just record them. Over time, look for patterns. Notice recurring symbols. Pay attention to the feelings in the dreams. Are you anxious, free, trapped, alive? The feeling tone often matters more than the literal content. Dreams don't usually speak literally. They speak symbolically. That garden Elizabeth dreamed of wasn't a literal garden, it was her inner life, her soul, the parts of herself she'd abandoned. Live with your dreams. Let them work on you. Ask them questions. What are you trying to show me? What part of myself am I seeing here? You don't need to be an expert analyst. You just need to take dreams seriously, to treat them as meaningful communication from a deeper part of yourself. Fourth, befriend your discomfort. When the little feeling arises, that vague unease, that quiet dissatisfaction, that small persistent sense that something's off, don't immediately try to fix it or push it away. Sit with it. Turn toward it with curiosity instead of fear. Ask it questions. What are you trying to tell me? What do you need? What wants to change? And then, listen. Sometimes the answer comes immediately. Sometimes it takes days or weeks of sitting with the question. But the act of asking, of treating the feeling as intelligent communication rather than a problem to eliminate, changes everything. You might try what I call active imagination, actually writing out a dialogue with the feeling. On one side of the page, you ask questions. On the other side, you let the feeling answer in its own voice. This sounds strange, I know, but it's remarkably effective. It makes the unconscious conscious. It creates relationship between the ego and the deeper self, and in that relationship, transformation happens. Fifth, create space for the unlived. This is crucial. If the little feeling is pointing toward some part of you that's been neglected or denied, find one small, genuine way to honor it. Not a grand dramatic gesture, but a real gesture. If you've longed to write, write one page. If you've craved silence and nature, take one walk. If you've missed creating with your hands, spend one afternoon painting or woodworking or gardening. If you've felt spiritually hungry, sit in meditation or prayer or simply silence for 20 minutes. The psyche responds to genuine action, not to resolutions or intentions. When you actually create space for the unlived life, even in the smallest way, the unconscious recognizes that you're serious. It recognizes that change is possible. And it begins to guide you more clearly, to show you the next step and the next. The key is that it must be genuine. It must be something that actually feeds your soul, not something you think you should do or something that looks impressive. The feeling knows the difference. Your unconscious knows when you're performing and when you're being real. Sixth, practice the dialogue technique I mentioned earlier. This is a form of active imagination that can be extraordinarily revealing. Take a piece of paper and divide it into two columns. On one side, write from your conscious ego, from the you that manages daily life. On the other side, right from the feeling, the symptom, the dream figure, the unlived part of yourself. Let there be an actual conversation. You might ask, "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" And then you let the other side answer. Don't censor it. Don't make it rational. Let it speak in its own voice, which might be poetic, or strange, or childlike, or fierce. This creates what I call a relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. And it's in relationship that healing happens, that integration happens, that the transcendent function can operate. When the two parts of you are talking to each other instead of one part simply repressing the other, new possibilities emerge. These practices are simple, but don't mistake simplicity for ease. They require commitment, honesty, courage. They require that you take your inner life seriously, that you treat your feelings as worthy of attention, that you value psychological and spiritual truth as much as external success. But if you do these things, if you genuinely commit to listening to the quiet voice within you, your life will change. Not overnight, not dramatically at first, but steadily, authentically, deeply. You'll find yourself making different choices, saying yes to things you would have dismissed, saying no to things you would have forced yourself to accept, moving toward what genuinely matters to you instead of what you think should matter. You'll discover that you have an inner guidance system you can trust. You'll learn to distinguish between the voice of fear and the voice of truth, between neurotic anxiety and authentic calling. You'll develop a relationship with your own depths, with the self that wants you whole, that wants you real, that wants you to live your actual life before it's too late. And you'll find that the little feeling you were so afraid of, that you tried so hard to ignore, was never your enemy. It was your truest friend, trying to save you from the tragedy of living someone else's life, while your own life waited, unlived, in the shadows. Let me bring all of this together now, because we've covered much ground, and I want you to leave here with something clear, something you can hold on to. The little feeling you've been ignoring is not your enemy. It is not weakness. It is not irrationality. It is not something to overcome, or medicate, or explain away. It is your psyche's way of guiding you back to yourself, back to the life you're meant to live before it's too late. The unconscious is wiser than the ego. It sees the whole picture of your life, what you're conscious of and what you've repressed, where you're aligned with your true nature and where you've betrayed it, what serves your individuation and what prevents it. And it communicates this wisdom through feeling, through symbol, through dream, through those small, persistent discomforts that don't make logical sense but carry profound psychological truth. When you finally learn to listen to its quiet voice, when you develop a relationship with this deeper intelligence within you, you discover something extraordinary. You've been homesick for a life you haven't yet lived, and the feeling has been showing you the way home all along. The work I'm asking you to do is not easy. Our entire culture teaches you to ignore this voice, to override it with logic and obligation and other people's expectations. You've been trained to distrust your feelings, to dismiss your longings, to silence the parts of yourself that don't fit the persona you've built. But the cost of that silence is your life, your actual life. Your one precious, unrepeatable, absolutely unique life. And the psyche will not tolerate the waste of that indefinitely. So here is what I want you to remember. Listen to the whispers, so you never have to hear the screams. Honor the small truth before it becomes the large crisis. Your feelings are not the problem. Your refusal to listen to them is. The psyche wants you whole. It wants you real. It wants you alive. Not half alive. Not living someone else's script, while your own story remains unwritten. And it will do whatever it takes to wake you up. It will speak gently first, through small feelings and quiet discomforts. But if you ignore those, it will speak through dreams, through symptoms, through crisis, through whatever is necessary to get your attention. The only question is whether you'll listen now, while the voice is still gentle, or wait until it has no choice but to shout. The choice has always been yours. The feeling has been trying to tell you this all along. You are not broken. You are not weak for feeling what you feel. You are not ungrateful, or foolish, or confused. You are a human being in the process of individuation. And your psyche is trying to guide you toward becoming who you actually are, instead of who you think you should be. That is not a problem. That is the very purpose of your life. So start listening. Start with 5 minutes tomorrow morning. Start with one small truth honored. Start with one dream recorded. Start with asking the feeling what it needs, instead of telling it to be quiet. Start befriending yourself. The whole self. Not just the acceptable parts. Start trusting that the discomfort you feel is not random but meaningful. Not a sign that something's wrong with you, but a sign that something's trying to become right. The path of individuation is not easy, but it is the only path that leads to genuine life, to meaning, to the feeling that you are living your days instead of simply surviving them. And the little feeling that quietly wants change is your invitation to that path. Everything you need to begin is already within you. The wisdom is there. The guidance is there. The self is there, waiting patiently for you to finally turn toward it and listen. If this exploration has touched something in you, if it has named what you've been feeling but couldn't articulate, I ask you to subscribe to this channel so you can continue this journey of psychological depth and self-discovery. Leave a like to support this work, and please, share in the comments below your own experience with these quiet feelings. What are they telling you? What are you learning to listen to? I genuinely want to know. Your story matters. Your inner life matters. Thank you for your attention and for your courage in looking within.